Muriam Haleh Davis is joining us for this book talk on Markets of Civilization, Racial Capitalism in Algeria. Muriam Haleh Davis is Associate Professor in the Department of History at UC Santa Cruz. Her recent book, Markets of Civilization, Islam and Racial Capitalism in Algeria, was published by Duke University Press in September 2022. She has also co-edited North Africa and the Making of Europe, Governance, Institutions, and Culture, which was published by Contemporary History, by Bloomsbury Press in 2018. She published in the Journal of Modern Intellectual History, Middle East Critique, the Journal of Contemporary History, Lateral, and 20 and 20 et 21, Revue de l'Histoire or Revue d'Histoire. She has also authored pieces of Al Jazeera English, Public Books, and Truth Out. She is on the editorial board of MERIP, Middle East Research and Information Project, and works with the Maghreb Page, is a co-editor with the Maghreb Page for Jadaliyya. And with that, let me welcome Muriam, who will be addressing us for a period of time, followed by a Q&A conversation that Muriam will actually field herself. And we also welcome questions on viewers on YouTube. If you can just add them to the comment section and we will relay them to Muriam. Thank you very much, Muriam, for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I have been working with you for many, many years, and I've known you for even longer from Georgetown University's days. We are very honored to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Bassam. And you know, I always love it when you speak French because you hide your French skills so well. So hearing you say 2021 was a real pleasure. First of all, I just want to say that, you know, the PESI has been a kind of intellectual home for me over the past 5 years that I've been involved. And so many of the fellows and colleagues and organizers have help shape this project in many ways. So I just want to start by thanking kind of the intellectual community that PESI has provided. Also all the work behind the scenes, Leila, Lucas, Ziad, Max, Bassam, of course. A lot has gone into making all of these sessions happen. So I'm really honored to be here. And I regret one of the things that comes out of PESI is often the kind of more informal socializing. And so I regret that, you know, we've lost out on that the last few years. But just to say, I'm around, I'm at Mesa usually, etc. So even if we haven't really gotten to chat informally here, if you see me somewhere or want to get a coffee, I think that the kind of networking isn't the right word, but the sense of community that comes out of PESI has been really great. So wanted to say all of that. I hope that there's a bit of an echo. That maybe I'm the only one who heard that. So I hope my screen sharing is working. Can everybody just see the actual part of the slide? Great. So I'm going to start out with an anecdote, and I really appreciated the conversation we had in the Racial Capitalism seminar the other day, and I kind of like the keynote to continue in that vein. So especially for the Q&A of things that I talk about in the book, you know, come back to the questions of racial capitalism we discussed. I'd like to open it up to a broader conversation that's not just about my work and about Algeria. But I would like to start with the anecdote that also opens the book, which is that on the 1st of April, 1947, the Swiss diplomat William Ripard gave the opening lecture at the first meeting of the Mount Pelerin Conference. This had been organized by none other than Friedrich Hayek, and often has been considered the first articulation of a neoliberal thought collective. Ripart himself had spent 18 years as the director of the mandate section at the League of Nations. And so he had been responsible for administering the colonies carved out of the Ottoman and German empires after World War I. So as he's giving this talk, Ripard mused on the alleged universality of Adam Smith's writings that assumed, and these are Ripard's words, that the average man always and everywhere sought to obtain the maximum amount of material satisfaction at a minimum cost of effort. end of the quote. And so this ideal of the rational, wealth maximizing subject, of course, has been written about often around the debates on kind of Homo economicus as a figure. But Ripard was troubled by the assumption that this model of humanity was relevant everywhere. And so he recounted his time in Algeria during the landing of the Allies officers in November of 1942. And so he goes on musing that he had been very impressed by the sight of the Arabs seated on the curb of sidewalks, who seemed quite indifferent to what was going on, and these are all his words, and were absolutely idle. And so he went up to a French friend and he kind of expresses his puzzlement at these idle Arabs on the sidewalk. And the French friend responds, quote, "The Arabs in Algiers never do any more work than is absolutely needed," and went on to explain that attempts by the French state to increase their rations had actually reduced their productivity. And so Ripard continues his musings, again, at this very important conference organized by Frederick Hayek, and he starts to wonder if the figure of Homo economicus was actually based on a Scottish template. Perhaps Homo economicus only worked because Adam Smith had been thinking about this figure of a Nordic mountaineer. I love this figure of the Nordic mountaineer, who somehow had very different sociological qualities from the Algerian Arabs. So Ripard muses, would Smith, Adam Smith, have defended the universality of Homo economicus if Adam Smith had been reared, and these are his words, among the sun-baked race of Arabs who prefer leisure to work, security on the lowest scale to the insecurity of initiative, and therefore equality to liberty. So Ripard himself does not pose this discussion in explicitly racial terms, but I think it's pretty clear that lurking behind this specter of the Scottish versus Arab template is how different races could be defined in relationship to labor and economic productivity. And so I opened the talk with this anecdote because I think it actually gets at the heart of my book, which looks at how the French state embarked on development programs after World War II. And at this moment, and in the kind of first throes of decolonization, economists and also politicians revisited older debates on the relationship between race and the economy. That is to say, with the Cold War raging in the background, they increasingly promoted market exchange as an essential weapon in defending Western civilization and combating these twin threats of totalitarianism on the one hand and decolonization on the other hand. And they saw them as linked, which I'm happy to talk about later. So this opening scene gives us some idea of how colonial development was influencing mainstream liberal discussions on economic orthodoxy. As I've mentioned, a lot has been written on this conference. But strangely, a lot has not been written on the colonial spaces that were the fodder for economic thought during this period. And so my book focuses on a particular moment in colonial development known as the Constantine Plan. And I'm happy to talk about the genealogy of the book project, but the dissertation was very much more focused on the Constantine Plan. The book project takes a longer arc that starts with the racial formation of settler colonialism in Algeria and takes us all the way through Ben Bella's first attempts at introducing a specifically Islamic socialism. So I'm going to try to hit all the major notes here in a relatively short talk. So trying to change slides here. Okay. So the book traces how colonial officials and metropolitan planners identified the economic capacities of Muslims as a key variable in economic reforms. And so this plan that I focus on, the Constantine Plan, was introduced by Charles de Gaulle in 1958 in the midst of the Algerian Revolution. And so when I started out the dissertation project, I was curious to know if the development plan differed from metropolitan or European attempts at reconstruction after World War II. So to put it in different terms, how did the colonial context and the fact that the majority of the Algerian population were Muslim influence how planners envisioned and implemented economic and social reforms with the purpose of introducing a more liberal market-based capitalism rather than the kind of closed colonial economy that had been the rule in Algeria up until this point. And so that was the first question. I was kind of trained as a good Foucaultian, and I was interested in economic discourse, not only as a way of thinking about the distribution of wealth and capital accumulation, although I do that in the book as well, but I was also interested in how economic discourse can reveal a broader imaginary about the human as a subject defined in part by economic behaviors. And so these are some other questions I was interested in. This racial or religious difference that existed in Algeria, and I put this in red and with a slash mark because it's something I really grappled with while revising the book. Of course, for reasons I can explain later, when we talk about Algerian Muslims, we're not really interested in their self-identification or their religious practices or whether they're saying their prayers or fasting. Islam in Algeria is a juridical category that foreclosed access not only to capital, but also to citizenship, and more or less established a dual system economically as well as in the realm of access to livelihood and even juridical laws and discriminations for basic criminal activities as well. So I'm happy to talk about that later. But the question then was, well, that's a religious issue, right? That it's a question about them being Muslims isn't race. And I really struggled with how do I take this framework and think about it in an area of the world where, according to most people, this is not about race. This is about colonial difference. It's about human difference, but we're not talking about race. And so my book really pushes back and says, yes, we need to be able to account for the way religion can be the grounding of racial discourses. And I'll come back to that in a second. And then I was also interested in what happens after independence. So the Algerian nation state wins independence in 1962. What happens to this body of economic thought? What happens to these initiatives of agrarian reform? What happens to the modernization and distribution of various agricultural products? What happens to the colonial legacy after independence? So as I was doing my dissertation research, I stumbled upon a quote that was really formative in helping me structure my arguments in the book. The book is structured around these two tropes or figures that are ideal types. These are not, sociologically existing individuals. Homo economicus on the one hand, and then Homo Islamicus on the other hand. So this is the quote that helped me kind of put some of the pieces analytically together. This quote is by a French technocrat who was one of the main architects of the Constantine Plan. And he wrote, and the part of the quote's on the slide here, thanks to the Constantine Plan, Homo economicus has been born. French technocrats are not known for their humility. They tend to think that whatever project they have is actually working, quite a delusional formation. So Homo economicus has been born. He has replaced Homo Islamicus, who accepted an extremely low level of material needs and who, as a result, did not feel the need to work more than was necessary. So this harkens back to the Ripard quote I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to continue reading the quote. He slowly has become Homo economicus, who is driven by his needs just as his European counterpoint is, and who consequently starts working and is concerned with the betterment of his output and bonuses, or with improving his skills, and who has the underlying and yet profound desire to uplift his children and the next generation. So this quote to me revealed this imaginary that Homo economicus, the kind of ideal resource maximizing subject, was conjugated alongside this figure of Homo Islamicus, right? Homo Islamicus as an ideal type rooted in Orientalist fantasies, who could then provide the foil for the European self-interested individual and man. That's also important here. And as we talked about a little bit in our session yesterday, or the day before, I don't know, all the days on Zoom blend together, the question of how feminist political economists have thought about labor and the self was really important for me in doing this project. Okay, so as I'm grappling with how planners use this accumulated Orientalist knowledge as they are reforming and implementing economic reforms, I wanted to try to figure out what to do with Islam and all of this. And it's in the title, so it did indeed play a role. And I started thinking about how one could talk about racial regimes of religion. And this photo here is of Marx in Algiers. I opened the book with Marx and his writings to Engels, his letters to Engels about Algeria and their capacity for revolution, which I'll talk about in a second. And so as I'm coming up with this terminology, I'm trying to account for the porous nature of race and religion as an analytic, but also as a historical category. And I don't think Algeria is exceptional here. I think one could read works on the Iberian Peninsula, colonial Mexico, Ireland. I think, there are multiple instantiations of how religious difference can come to be the basis for a racial formation. And so I also wanted to show how these shifting visions of capitalism were entangled with racial projects in that they assigned differential capacities and values based on innate characteristics. And so here, it's worth perhaps just mentioning quickly that Max Weber's argument on the Protestant work ethic often comes to mind when you're having these kinds of discussions. And he famously argues that Calvinist view of individual election or salvation encouraged hard work and efficiency, which was important for capitalism. But we tend to forget that he actually contrasted that with Islam, which he saw as organized around predetermination instead of predestination. And so while perhaps we read Weber in terms of kind of religious ideal types, when you look at the footnotes of that work, he's pretty open regarding the fact that religion shapes biological reproduction. And so he writes about the importance of hereditary or biological factors in creating attitudes towards capitalism. And he actually says that advances in racial neurology and psychology would eventually confirm his analysis. So, again, thinking about what the imaginary of religion does and insisting that this is not just about faith or transcendence, this is about racial formation, bloodlines, and origin, help me kind of push the boundaries a little bit in coming up with a way to think about race and religion together. And here I'm riffing off of Brenna Bundar's notion of a racial regime of ownership. And as I've mentioned already, Islam as a juridical category influenced access to capital, taxes, land, etc. And so one of the interventions in framing this around racial capitalism is also to rethink debates between post-colonial studies and Marxism in the last 10 years or so. I don't know if people followed the polemics around Vivek Chibber's work, but I was interested in trying to find a way to think about representation and actual capitalist accumulation together. And so, I start the book with Marx in Algiers, kind of as a provocation, in that when you read Marx's understanding of Algerian traditions of land use, he often casts it in terms of a much more familiar to him Germano-Slavic tradition. And he misses, I argue, how family structures and social hierarchies rooted in Islam prevented these lands from being truly collective. And he remarks that while the Muslims' hatred of Christianity stems from a deep desire for equality, which sounds kind of promising in a revolutionary capacity, he also thinks that the natives are damned without a true revolutionary movement. And here we get a sense of the ways in which a revolutionary tradition rooted in Islam will never be good enough for the Marxist tradition in certain ways. And I say that because the end of the book comes to post-colonial Algeria, when a host of French Marxists and anarchists come to help Ben Bella start this socialist experiment with self-management. And they are continuously complaining about the fact that Ben Bella uses Islam as a rallying cry, because for them, in this very French anti-clerical tradition, revolution has to be secular. And so here too, this kind of rejoins what Cedric Robinson writes about in his own critique of a certain Marxist canon. And Cedric Robinson talks about Marx as a form of secular messianism. And this has been useful for me, again, thinking with Marxist categories, but also thinking about the role of religion and race in them. So, and Cedric Robinson's critique of racialism and the foundations of capitalism are a bit different than what I'm doing. But as I mentioned yesterday, in thinking about racial capitalism as a method, some of these debates help me, I think, frame economic reform in a different light. And so the story I'm telling might be seen as just a rehashing of colonial 19th century myths of the lazy Oriental that we all know quite well. But I'm trying to think about this at a particular moment after World War I, where people like Angus Bergen have argued that market society is reinvented after the Great Depression. And I argue that this fundamentally changes not only how the introduction of capitalism is working in terms of modernization and markets, but also how racial classification operates at the same time. And so there are kind of three moments in the book. I won't have time to go into all of them. The first is the interwar period, where you see a rise in development policies, you see an infusion of capital into big infrastructural projects, and what people working on French Empire call mise en valeur, as a doctrine of state-funded investment. And then I move in the third and fourth chapters to the 1950s, the War of Independence, and also the rise of technocracy under the French Fifth Republic. So the moment of the Algerian Revolution, but also the moment of the Fifth Republic that brings Western social sciences into mainstream economic planning in fundamentally new ways. And then lastly, the end of the book, the last two chapters, looks at Algerian nationalism and how racial capitalism, I think, can elucidate some of the debates on Algerian identity and also economic policy after 1962. So I think there's been a number of books that try to look at continuities in decolonization. Jemima Pierre's book on the fact of Blackness on post-colonial Ghana, for example, that asks what happens to the racial formation once the colonists leave, and how does that morph or get conscripted into new state projects. And here, the question of Islam and socialism becomes really important for me. So I'm going to start briefly with this interwar period. It's one of my favorites because it deals with olive oil and wine. And I think kind of what better way to tell the story of race, the economy, and the Mediterranean than charting how people understood the economic potential of olive oil as a native crop on the one hand and wine as a European crop on the other. And so here, for, those studying the Middle East, this is a time across the region when there was a discourse about the Mediterranean and Mediterranean belonging that emerges in opposition to nationalist claims. So Charles Korm in Lebanon, who writes about the Phoenician or Christian roots of Lebanese national identity. You could think of Pharaonic Egypt also as a counter narrative to those who are looking to Arab Muslim identity. And something similar happens in Algeria, where many of the European settlers want to define Algeria as a Mediterranean melting pot. And so this is a pretty well-known trope in terms of people like Albert Camus or others. But what I find really fascinating is how this reconfiguration of Algeria's racial formation also underpins economic development and the accumulation of capital in the sectors of olive oil and wine. And so during the interwar period, you have citrus and wine that are also receiving significant amount of investment in terms of how to standardize these products and how to commodify them, right? How to make them in line with European standards so they can be exported and be legible as a commodity on a European market. And you know, these are products that had been the basis of colonial capitalism at the start of the 19th century, but had become less competitive in the 1930s due to the changing nature of the international economy. And many of the investments that the French state makes are based on the symbolic importance of these crops. So these crops are often geared for export. The wine is a settler commodity, and both of these also would require big investment by the state in terms of infrastructure and credit in order to become profitable on a kind of Mediterranean scale. And yet, despite enormous evidence to the contrary, French officials repeatedly claim that the Islamic prohibition against wine, rather than the structures of colonial capitalism, was the reason why settlers disproportionately owned wine vineyards. So I found archival evidence of, you know, Algerians asking for credit, asking to be able to have the economic capital necessary to begin growing wine. And time again, they are denied by the state, but the public facing response to this is always, well, you know, Islam won't allow Muslims to grow wine, and that's why it is a European dominated economy. So, you know, olive oil is the foil to this. It's predominantly cultivated by Algerians, and planners repeatedly refuse to give any capital to olive growers or to modernize olive oil mills, saying that the natives won't be able to understand how to market this, and they don't have the ability of foresight that would allow them to be kind of good capitalists on a market economy. And so, you know, here you start to see how the literary discourses that cast Algerian Muslims as other to the Mediterranean coincide with or overlap with economic discourses around Mediterranean agriculture or around Eurafrica, which is a big discussion at this time. How do you make Algeria part of the European economic community? Because since Algeria was legally part of France, it's not technically a colony. So when the precursor to the EU, the European Economic Community, is signing the Treaty of Rome, Algeria is actually part of France. So whatever is happening at the European level is going to influence Algeria as well. And so in both the realm of literary production and racial description, as well as in the realm of reorganizing Algeria's economy, you see the way the Mediterranean provides a kind of whitewashing for this project in which Algerian Muslims are seen as external or marginal due to their kind of civilizational capacities. So these are some of the debates that I tackle in the interwar period. But the meat of the book, I think, is the period following World War II and the introduction of the Constantine Plan, as I already mentioned. So, as was the case in many places in the global South and also Europe, the end of World War II was the high point for an economic drive towards modernization. And in France, the Fifth Republic really brings to power the full force of French economic planning as a doctrine. And Algeria, I argue, is not so much a laboratory for modernity, insofar as there's a circulation of expertise on both shores of the Mediterranean. But it's fascinating to me when I started the project I assumed that, this is a big deal development project. Algeria is, fighting for independence. And so my assumption was who would lead this development project? People who knew something about North Africa, right? Maybe some ethnologists, you always have to look for the ethnologists in the 1950s doing shady things. But no, the people who come in to lead the Constantine Plan are actually technocrats who have cut their teeth on European economic integration. And so at one point, when somebody is talking to Charles de Gaulle about the Algerian Revolution or the Algerian War, as the French call it, he says, an economist will fix this for me, right? He has unbridled faith in economic planning as a tool of pacification, of military pacification. And so on this slide on the left, the man in the front in the suit is Paul Delouvrier, who is a very famous figure in the history of European economic integration. And somehow nobody had really thought to pay attention to what he was doing in Algeria for these 2 years between 1958 and 1960. And you see him next to his military counterpart, the General Schall. And so in the book, I argue that the consolidation of economic planning as a discipline and the rising influence of the social sciences in thinking about capitalist expansion fundamentally changed how planners and politicians understood the racial religious difference of Algerians. And so consistent with the French post-war embrace of colorblindness, after the Fourth Republic, race is taken out of the Constitution. After the Holocaust, everybody understands that racism, has to be put an end to and not spoken about. And so in light of this tradition of colorblindness that comes to the fore after World War II, planners avoid any explicit reference to race or religion in planning. But at the same time, there are assumptions about Muslims built into the plan. So another way to think about this is that racial hierarchies that were constructed through colonization are embedded. They're allowed to continue in the plan, but they're also completely disavowed. So there's no mention of the kind of history of colonization and how this might affect different sectors of the colonial economy. And so one question that's raised is whether Muslims could participate in so-called industrial civilization. And the answers to this tend to differ, but they're always informed by a robust study of psychology, of statistics, and the line between colonial development and psychological warfare is incredibly thin. Delouvrier argues that the Constantine Plan should have a mystique or a recognizable brand, but planners are also worried that because Algerian Muslims are, in their mind, not economists, it was preferable, in their words, for numbers to give way to images that respond to their most immediate preoccupations. And so time and time again, the planners overlook the structural obstacles to economic development, such as the organization of credit or stipulations regarding technical assistance for agriculture, and instead focus on Islam as the real obstacle to market production. And so one of the bodies I study are these agricultural welfare societies, or the SAPs, the Société Agricole de Prévoyance, that are created specifically to help Muslim farmers. But at the same time as they have this task of helping Muslim farmers, they are supposed to make a profit. And they're supposed to avoid any ambiguity that this was a form of charity, right? This is a very post-war formation, that this should be kind of an entrepreneurial forum and not just a kind of social uplift mechanism. And so there's this contradictory situation where they want to, on the one hand, help the fellahin, but also liberalize what had been an autarkic system. And so on the right, I think, of your screen, with the blue image, you have a page from this almanac for Algerian farmers. And it's actually a very funny read insofar as the publication tries to mirror Joha stories, but at the same time explain capitalist notions of profit or how a loan functions. There's all kinds of Arabic mistakes all over the document. And sometimes, right, as in here, you will see a kind of injunction that sounds like it's from a hadith, and here it's min radiha bil qalil min al-rizq, radiha Allahu an, radiha Allah anhu bil qalil min al-amal. So he who is satisfied by meager wealth, God will grant him a meager amount of work, right? So you see how the planners are using Islam and working through it to try to incite capitalist development. And so these discussions about whether or not the Falah could be modernized were also shot through with the question of, is the Algerian Falah the same as the French paysan or peasant? Are these comparable figures? And the entire field of rural sociology is at work here in trying to distinguish what is specific about the African peasant, and can you even call it a peasant? So there is a discussion that's at once important for how economic reforms are implemented, but also about the kind of racial basis for the peasant as a figure in different geographical spaces. So, the Constantine Plan is where kind of the meat of my analysis is, and even people who disagreed on this, i.e. whether Homo Islamicus could be made into Homo Economicus. There were disagreements on the answer to that question, but they all structured the discussion around these two figures or tropes. So I don't mean to imply that there is a general consensus. The army is much more conservative, the technocrats are kind of more liberal. But what I'm interested in is how this vocabulary is structured, and how it has concrete implications for the way that capitalist reforms are implemented in Algeria, particularly in the domain of agriculture. So moving on quickly, I've skipped over a lot of the ways the FLN responds to the Constantine Plan during the revolution. I'm happy to talk about that. But what I try to show after 1962 is what happens to the Algerian economy and what happens to this grammar of Homo Islamicus and Homo Economicus once the French depart, at least formally. There's lots of neo-colonial things happening, but at least once Algerians win formal sovereignty. And when Ben Bella comes to power, and of course, the transition is incredibly difficult. Algeria is on the brink of a civil war in the month after it wins independence. But he states that a specifically Algerian socialism rooted in Islam would be the state policy. And so, it's not surprising that Ben Bella opts for a radical socialist program, and this kind of radical break with the colonial system, although in practice he's forced to actually offer a fair amount of concessions on that. But what I argue is that the racial regime of religion introduced by colonial policy can help us understand two things. One, why in Algeria Islam rather than Arabness becomes the cornerstone of Algerian nationalism, but also why the economy becomes a particularly important domain in terms of fashioning revolutionary subjects that were supposed to be the basis of citizenship after independence. And so I don't want to go too into the weeds here, but the June 1962 Tripoli program in Algeria, which is a kind of early blueprint for the young nation state, claims that Islam functions as more than a religion and specifies that religion would provide the main source for Algerian culture and personality. Similarly, in 1963, there's a citizenship law that invokes Islam as a hereditary principle and consolidates Islam as a cultural framework and origin rather than belief. So it was necessary for the father of an individual to have been born in Algeria, but also to have fallen under Islamic personal status law during colonization, which is exactly the construction that allowed for Algerian Muslims to have second-class citizens or to be indigène or indigenous, be subject to kind of indigenous law, which in the French framework means a kind of discriminatory legal system. And that's also the basis on which citizenship is foreclosed to Algerians in the colonial period. And so in this part of the book, I look at the Arabic journal Al-Marifa, which is published by the Ministry of the Habus. And here you see, I think, really interesting arguments. For example, that while the committees of self-management in Algeria were inspired in part by what was happening in Yugoslavia, they were also an embodiment of the Islamic category of Hisba, which harkens back to Abbasid times, and the figure of the Muhtasab, right, who personally controlled markets and moral, and also played moral functions. And so this also follows, a broader argument in the region. Mustafa Sibai's work, Ishtirakiyat al-Islam, that's published in 1959. And so I'm trying to insert Algeria into these wider debates on Islam and socialism, and show how Islam provided the basis of a new model of Algerian production, morality, and solidarity. So I'm just going to, as I start wrapping up, leave you with another quote. This is from the Minister of Agriculture and Agrarian Reform, and he specifically constructs economic activity in religious terms. So he writes, Al-Baraka fil Haraka, there is benediction in movement. The Algerian masses, which were previously prisoners of fatalism and superstition, are not only developing a collective will and a force of energy, but an authority that will replace the destructible colonial power. And this is where I think it gets really good. Islam is thus not a backwards hereditary defect, nor an ideological obstacle, but a motor nerve that is necessary for the revolution. And part of the book, in thinking about the continuities in racial formations and racial capitalism, look at Algeria's often ambiguous place in Pan-African and Pan-Arab visions. So here you see, of course, Nasser and Ben Bella together. Algeria's relationship with Egypt is far more complicated than I think a lot of people realize, insofar as the Arabness that was underscored in much of Nasser's ideology fits really badly in Algeria, not only because Arabic has been totally eliminated in terms of Fusha from French Algeria. It's considered a foreign language. And when Ben Bella goes to Egypt to give a speech and he ends up crying because he's not able to give it in Fusha, he learns Fusha later in life. But also because you have the Amazigh populations who also are not, who have been, the first political opponent to the Algerian regime is Ait Ahmed, and there had been the Berber crisis of 1949. So there are lots of reasons why Arabness is not what leaders necessarily can embrace. Of course, in an ideological fashion, they do, and they are involved in many of these discussions, but there's also a kind of rub there. And one could say a similar thing about Pan-Africanism, and I'm happy to talk about Fanon's role in all of this, which is something I'm writing on now. But in terms of what do you do, is Africa a racial or continental or political designation? And there's lots of discussions about this, much of which come to a head in the 1969 Pan-African Festival in Algiers. And so this part of the book also looks at some of the proclamations of support for Algeria coming from the Mashrek. And so here there is a national committee for Algerian victory in Lebanon, and they are sponsoring these days for the support of Algeria, and their way of understanding the Algerian war is very much about kind of the shores of Arabness assimilating North Africa, which is not necessarily how Algerians themselves are seeing their place in the Middle East. And there's some very tense backs and forths in journals like Al-Adab or other Arabic publications, struggling over how does Algeria fit into Pan-Arabism. So perhaps I'll stop there. I have one more. So that doesn't work. Yeah, I mean, I'll stop there and leave time for debates, but I guess in finishing up the talk, I'm trying to get at how decolonization changed the politics of development, but also how these anti-colonial figures inherited a colonial grammar that posited a natural or essential correspondence between religious principles and economic organization, and how in turn that influenced Algeria's socialist experiment under Ben Bella. And so these tropes of Homo Islamicus or Homo Economicus don't just disappear in 1962. They continue to be a vocabulary that structures development after the fall of the colonial state. And so in speaking to kind of Middle East studies more broadly, my hope is that the book helps us understand how religious divisions that structured imperial belonging also played a role in subsequent constructions of nation states and in socialist discourses and reforms, and how this then was reflected in various discussions on national identity. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I'm happy to not only take questions about the book, but also perhaps to revisit some of our discussions from the session on racial capitalism or anything else that might be interesting to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariam. This was illuminating as usual, and I am very glad that we had the opportunity to host you. As people can share their questions in the next minute, I just want to thank you also for playing the role of co-director along with Max Isle for this PESI. I'd like to also thank the remarkable team that has helped put this together, including Leila Hashimi, Lucas Summers, and Ala. They have been added. They're always in the background working with all of us. And also thanks to Ziad Abu Rish for not only being an instructor in this Summer Institute, but also being what we call our legacy director who ran PESI last year and some years prior. I will let you field questions and people can intervene. If you'd like to come back to the Zoom with your video, please feel free. And I'll also share with you any questions that we might have from YouTube. The floor is open.
That is a great question. Thanks, Muriam.
And I'll, Muriam, just to let you know, I'm just going to be in the background, so I'll let you field the questions as we agreed.
Okay, great. And also, if you feel comfortable, feel free to just ask me to unmute yourself and jump in. So I have a few things to say about this. I did the very scary thing of giving some of my first book talks in French. And that was really difficult, precisely because the discussions on race and racism and Islamophobia in France are very hot right now for terrible reasons. But one of the things I'm hoping this book does politically on the French side is that there have been a lot of discussions around Islamophobia, or which I've been called this ad nauseum, Islamo-gauchism, right? A kind of Islamo-leftism, which I've written about in Jadaliyya a bit. I was involved in the Kamel Daoud affair in France, which ended up being a big polemic. So I've been kind of at the heart of, or at least on the fringes, if not the heart of some kind of nasty polemics in France around Islamophobia. And a lot of my friends, even on the left, would say to me, look, this concept of Islamophobia is meaningless because Islam is a religion. And it's about theology, it's about precepts. And if you don't like it, you can always convert. So like, how can you talk about this as a racial category when all you have to do is convert, and then you're no longer inscribed in that group of people? And part of the book is trying to show that this was never about religion and this was never about faith, that the longer genealogy of this is about, the most clear indications of racism, which are in the realm, I would say, not only of the law, but also the economy, right? That you can trace these things through legal, but also patterns of accumulation, et cetera. So in France, it was tough. I think that there's a younger generation that's much more open and is actually kind of hungry for some tools coming out of the US. There was also lots of rubbish about the threat of wokeism and post-colonial studies with, the Ministry of Education trying to ban post-colonial studies. I mean, it's just been it's been a bit of a shit show over there. So that, on the one hand, that's been happening. I would say my Algerian colleagues, and unfortunately, I've been having visa issues to get back to Algeria for a long time. But I think they see this as a way of having some new tools to understand colonialism that aren't just about a kind of French-Algerian conversation. So I think they're actually very enthusiastic to have people in Anglophone worlds writing about this with some new tools that feels less, there's this constant kind of embattlement between French and Algerian historians that has gotten worse under Macron. I will also say Jacob Mundy, who I don't know if he's still here, but wrote a really lovely review of my book. So thank you for that, Jacob. On the other hand, there have been some reactions by an older generation of political scientists, one review in particular, that was very hostile. And, that's okay. I don't expect everyone to want to think about racial capitalism in the Middle East. And I don't expect, I don't want to say anything bad about political scientists. Some of them are my very good friends. Hi, Bassam. It's not their fault. Nobody's perfect, as Hisham Salam would say. But certainly, I think there have been some quarters that kind of missed the argument and saw me as saying that French technocrats are racist, right? Which is not at all the argument of the book. I'm not interested in individuals being racist or not. So that's a long response, but it's been interesting to see how this is received differently in the US, France, and Algeria. Sorry, I'm fielding my own questions, Chris.
Hi, Muriam. Thank you. I had two questions. I hope that's okay. The first one was to do with the interwar period, when you talked about investment in infrastructure in Algeria. And I wondered what that looked like. I'm interested in, have done previous research on the citrus trade in Palestine, and in the war period you get the citrus belt and the development of new ports, which isn't strictly just for the citrus trade, but it's part of exporting those oranges. So I wondered what the kind of infrastructure physically looked like in France, in Algeria at the time. And the second question was, you mentioned the term a couple of times in your talk, but modernity and grappling with this term, and how much did you choose to use that in your book? What were your kind of approaches to it?
Yeah, thank you. Those are both great questions. So for the interwar period, and I would love to talk to you more about citrus. I actually have I have a little thing on citrus in MERIP, and kind of the way citrus economies in the US, Palestine, and Algeria are all kind of looking at each other. Some of my planners actually do a citrus map of California and Algeria kind of grafted onto one another. So, there's of course questions of irrigation and credit and dams that need to go into that production. But what I really focus on is this institution. Everything in French colonial economic reform world is an acronym. So the acronym is OFALAC, OFALAC. And basically they decide that instead of a kind of mass produced model where, all markets would hold the same products, that they would start differentiating in terms of quality. And they would put an enormous amount of resources into producing the kinds of, in terms of ripeness, in terms of taste, in terms of size, and standardizing that in order to be able to export those to Europe on a more competitive basis. And so the entire ways in which agricultural training, but also credit structures work are now geared towards that. And what I find fascinating about OFALAC are these discussions around shipping, around containers, around different technologies to keep produce fresh. I'm unfortunately, I don't have a great head for the science technology studies part of this, but that would be a great project for people who could actually follow the way some of these chemical processes function with regards to citrus, but also in terms of refrigerated shipping, for example. So these are some of the ways in which the basis for colonial capitalism, and this is not my argument. Lots of people have made this point that in the interwar period, the kind of political economy changes around agriculture, standardization, and commercialization. Yeah, modernity is not a word I love. And Fred Cooper was this will be probably shocking, but Fred Cooper was my advisor as a PhD student. And he has a good, healthy diatribe against the word modernity that I understand where he's coming from. But I find it useful in terms of kind of the fantasies that underpin European economic projects and what that tells us about commitments to efficiency, commitments to kind of temporality and a way of projecting the future. And so I guess I kind of use it as shorthand in that way, especially insofar as Homo economicus and Homo Islamicus are foils. I almost titled the book From Homo Islamicus to Homo Economicus, and luckily a good friend told me this is a terrible book title. Nobody will buy the book. So I don't mean modernity in a kind of argument around the origins of capitalism or something like that. I mean it more in terms of a certain commitment to maybe an enlightenment vision of the self that then gets picked up in certain articulations of political economy. Yeah, Ranjani.
Yeah, I guess I had a question about if you could talk a little more about the racial regime of, sort of maybe racial differentiation within Algerian Muslims.
Yeah.
And probably what is produced through colonialism there.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a good question and also a difficult one, insofar as part of taking on a settler colonial lens is thinking about this in terms of a zero-sum relationship or kind of dichotomy between colonized and settlers as a kind of one-to-one. That's not the way the social world in Algeria actually looked, right? So I find it useful as an analytic to understand some of the basic patterns in access to livelihood and to capital, but within, of course, the people that I'm terming, Algerian Muslims, there are many divisions. Not only do you have the Amazigh Arab division, which is a colonial construct, but does matter in terms of how people understand themselves. I could have also mentioned people from the South and skin color and kind of anti-Black racism, which is part of the story of North Africa as well. There's also the question of Algerian Jews who are Arab but get French citizenship en masse in 1870, which Algerian Muslims do not until World War II. So I argue that there's a kind of whitening of Algerian Jews insofar as their subject position is that of a French citizen, which changes dramatically. Does that mean they're not subjects of, anti-Semitism during World War II? No, or anti-Arab racism? No. But from this lens I've adopted, which also stemmed with a certain exhaustion. There had been a lot of work in French colonial studies about kind of hybridity and contact and these worlds of exchange. And I wanted a way to say, I understand that that's like interesting to study, but there are these ways that there is a bifurcation in terms of access to wealth and capital and livelihoods and taxation and infrastructure and credit that fall along these lines. Like so there is, a more complicated story of racial formation to be told. But at the end of the day, the Amazigh populations also are excluded from citizenship on the basis of Islam, despite the kind of French colonial idea that somehow they were only superficially Muslim or whatever. And I think there's another, question, perhaps that your comment reminded me of, which is I don't want to be saying that whenever there's religious difference, it's racism, or that racial formation exists anywhere there's religious difference. I think then the question of race becomes too capacious and perhaps a bit meaningless. And so in Algeria, I find it useful precisely because the settler colony makes it so clear, and the legal apparatus through which Algerians are excluded is so clear. So I hope it opens up doors for other people to think about religion and race, sectarianism and race. But I'm not comfortable making a claim saying kind of whenever there's Islamophobia or anti-Muslim sentiment, it has to be racism, or of saying whenever there's Muslims somewhere in the minority or in the majority, we're talking about race. I think, the vocabulary of racial formation and the specific racial projects are really important to keep in mind. And so how far I'd be comfortable stretching this analysis geographically or analytically, I'm not totally sure. And I get, I'm still grappling with that. Like, certainly one could think about the way that Islam becomes a racial category in lots of places, right? I mean, that India, the US in a post 9/11 moment, but I don't want to say that wherever, kind of where Muslims are always already racialized or something. I think that's kind of easy. And I think the vocabulary of racialized also doesn't tell us much. Like to say that somebody is racialized to me doesn't mean anything. Like the category of whiteness is also a racialization. So the book was an exercise in picking apart how the racial formation actually works, rather than starting, with the kind of Muslims are racialized in colonial Algeria, because I don't know what that means. And it doesn't provide enough fodder for those historians in France, for example, who are trying to say, no, this isn't about race, right? Because it's just a question of representation. And it wasn't. It was a question of capital, access to markets and to capital. Oh, yes. This restate the question that was just asked was about the question of the racial regime of religion in Algeria, but also the kind of different diversity of people living in Algeria and how that might complicate it. That's how I understood the question. Yes, is it a question in the comment? Do you want to jump in, or should I just read it and respond?
I can,
yeah, go ahead. Thanks.
I can read it. I
Thanks.
was just saying thank you for this work, Muriam, massively insightful and brave. I wonder how the racial regimes that you describe inform processes of class formation in Algeria today. So like how do they manifest today? And how have they evolved, I guess, and continue to be?
Yeah, that is a great and difficult question. I think I can only answer it partially. One is the question of Islam and the economy came back during, I end the book with the Hirak and the figure of Malik Ben Nabi, who writes what is it, the title of the book? Al-Muslim fil Alam al-Iqtisad, or something like, it's something, the Muslim in the world of the economy. And Malik Ben Nabi came back with kind of a vengeance during the Hirak as a figure, and was very polarizing in terms of how people read him. And so, at the same time that was happening, there were laws around hydrocarbons and international investors having kind of a bigger stake in the Algerian economy that the Hirak protesters really had rejected and were protesting against, and which showed a kind of third worldism that was still nascent. I don't think either of those really answer your question. I mean, in terms of class formation, certainly people who have an ability to send their kids to France, who have access to foreign capital, still constitute the elite in many ways. And even in terms of, thinking about the Algerian history of olive oil and wine, that also continues to the present. Algeria is now trying to commercialize its olive oil in Europe. That's pretty recent. And much of the kind of bureaucracy of the Algerian state ended up blocking, kind of real agricultural expertise in the domain. So you had kind of officials who were responsible for doing this who didn't know much about olive oil. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's kind of the best I can do in thinking about the really, tumultuous economic liberalization policies of the 1980s in Algeria, which I don't touch on, right? Algeria also has a kind of opening towards certain kinds of neoliberal reforms and of course the Civil War, which we talked about in Peter Moore's discussion, and that changes the way things look. So because my analysis ends in 1965, I don't feel like I can do a kind of clean history from 1965 to the present in terms of how much, I mean, Jacob would actually be better on this question than I would in terms of class formation from the 1970s to the present. Yeah, thank you. We can also go back to the heated debate we were having about class the other day. Yeah, Chris.
I have another question, but if there's anyone else wanted to ask, because I've already asked a question.
I think so. Okay, we're at that awkward Zoom silence moment, so please.
I wanted to know how much the ideas, sorry, again, it's an interwar period question, but how much, or if at all, did the ideas that that were being discussed at the time, you said about this stereotyping that Arabs didn't need to work more than was necessary, and these kind of tropes of, I guess, colonial tropes, how much those, if at all, they filtered down into amongst Algerian society? And I'm thinking about, the kind of middle elite classes, the intellectuals, and if this became a trope that they attach themselves to as well.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. One of the figures I'm really fascinated with, and I wasn't able to do as much as I would have liked with him in the book, is an Algerian, the highest ranking Algerian in the French technocracy, who's also responsible for the Constantine Plan and who kind of dies in really mysterious circumstances during the war. And I'm interested with him because he takes on this kind of apolitical, so there's a question, the FLN perhaps is getting information from him, but he's working for the French. And in his eyes, at least, the most important thing is for Algeria's economy to be healthy, and it doesn't really matter who he's doing that for. So there's a kind of an economism, not in Jake's sense, but in a kind of classic sense, where this can be apolitical, that development could be apolitical. And I do think that very much does trickle down into the Algerian bureaucracy. And, as does, there's a kind of distrust or condescension towards the Algerian population by the regime that we see across the region. I don't think that's, specific to Algeria, but there's a lot of colonial tropes in the way that leaders talk about the people. And again, thinking about 2011 to 2020 in protests, one of the claims made by protesters was that this was a kind of continuation of colonialism, that this was, that now they were being colonized not by France, but by Algerian elites. So, the imaginary of development as a technocratic endeavor, which also, the Algerian state opens up École Nationale d'Administration, like the ENA, which is, I might be getting that acronym wrong, all these acronyms, but the French state has a way of training technocrats and technocratic elite that is copied by the Algerian state after independence. So, despite the kind of revolutionary divergence of Algeria and its socialist years, there are still, I think, deep patterns in terms of thinking about the population and ruling elite, but also in terms of thinking about economic orthodoxies and planning. So I hope that gets to some of your question.
We seem to have a question from YouTube. Hello? Did we lose Muriam? All right. So
Sorry,
I'll be happy to.
I noticed the question on YouTube. It's not mine, but I can read it out.
Well, yes, it's from EdWeb, but the thing is that Muriam is not with us. Does anybody want to volunteer to answer the question? I'm joking. Let's just see. Let me call Muriam and see if she'll.
Muriam is back, I think.
I'm back. I'm so sorry. Like I was saying, somehow I live next to Silicon Valley and I still have rubbish internet.
No worries, Muriam. Very happy that you're back, because I was forcing people to volunteer to answer the question that we have, the next question, but you helped a lot by coming back. I just I'll read this to you, but I'll also put it on in the chat. This is a question from Ed Webb. I'm not gonna make a joke about web, from the internet, from YouTube. How much did these concepts of racial capitalism travel to the non-settler colonies next door in Tunisia and Morocco before 1956, and did they affect post-colonial economic policies?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And Benoit Chalon was just here last week at UCSC, and we were talking about this in the Tunisian case, because he saw a lot of continuities in terms of colonial economic policies, especially this kind of notion of Tunisie utile or inutile, the kind of useful coastal areas, and the way that, the hinterlands have different economic patterns versus the coast. But I do think Algeria is very specific in terms of being an integral part of France, 3 French departments. And so I think there is a kind of general notion of the fatalism or unproductiveness of Arabs. But I think that's a kind of broader Orientalist trope that one can see in a lot of places. I think the way it gets put into practice in Algeria through the revolution and counterinsurgency, and through these laws around citizenship, and which go on to influence things like taxation, are pretty specific. So even though I think French planners could have a common imaginary of development and what this means in Islamic contexts, I do think the specificity of Algeria as a settler colony matters. And as I was saying earlier, I kind of leave it to scholars of different regions to grapple with how helpful this is in their context, because I don't want to make a blanket claim insofar as specific policies. But going back to our discussion about Robinson, or about racial capitalism as a framework, I do think that ideas about human differences and religious differences end up kind of nourishing some of the vocabularies of liberal political economy as they get instituted in colonial spaces. So that's a kind of non-response, but I both want to be attentive to kind of the broad histories of racial capitalism in terms of economic thought and relationships with the global South on the one hand, but also encourage people to do the hard work of looking at particular racial formations and political economy in local places, rather than extrapolating that into kind of a global racial project. Because, as we all know, there can be no meta theory of racial capitalism based on, a definition. It has to do with local patterns of power and of accumulation.
Was the Algerian Amazigh population differently integrated in the racial regime, or was it just part of the Algerian Muslim?
Yeah, in terms of legally, it was part of the Algerian Muslim, the legal status, but it was integrated differently insofar as French capitalists preferred having Amazigh laborers come to France. So you see, when people are recruiting Algerian labor, especially in the metropole, a preference for, and there's a good chapter in the edited volume I put together that looks at this in terms of Morocco and Belgium, and the ways that mining companies in Belgium recruited North African labor. So I do think you see it differently, a different relationship certainly in terms of, we were talking about the proletarianization and the proletariat in France, but in terms of Algerian law or patterns of incorporation in Algeria, despite the kind of myth of the good Kabyle, they, for all intent, that group, for all intents and purposes, was also foreclosed from French citizenship. It's Salah Bouakir, and I end the book. I can put it in the chat. I end the book with him.
Yes, this was a question from YouTube. From Sultan, what was the name of the Algerian technocrat working for France and possibly the FLN? And our speaker said it's Salah.
Yeah, Bouakir. And if anybody knows more about him, I would love. I've done as deep of a dive as I could. I went to the British archives to try to find stuff, as well as Algeria and France. But there's a little bit on him on the epilogue of the book. But I would love to know more.
All right. Any other questions? Well, I am very happy that we were able to address your questions both here and on YouTube. Apologies again for those of you who joined yesterday because we had a bit of a delay. We fixed it today. Thanks to Muriam. Do you have any last words or closing words, Muriam, just in case?
Yeah, I would just say that I'd really love to keep in touch with folks. I'm not just saying that. I find this forum of...
No, you're speaking to the world right now, not just to the...
Okay, well, to the fellows, and I mean, I'm a generally accessible person, so and the world, why not? But especially for the fellows, just to say that I read your projects. I really enjoyed speaking with all of you, and that I really mean it when I say, please shoot me an email, keep in touch, flag me down at Mesa. I'm going to be in France and Tunisia for the next 6 months, so if you're coming through there, look me up. But I part of being on Zoom is wonderful, in part because at least we get to do this, but I also really miss getting to chat with you all.
Thank you so much, Muriam.
Not those on YouTube. If there are any trolls on YouTube, I'm not speaking to the troll. If there are any trolling elements watching this on YouTube, this was for the fellows. Well,
the good thing about academic knowledge production is that we're not really actually reaching
anybody. That's true.
Huge crowd. Okay. Thank you so much, Muriam, for really, I mean, people say this after every talk because they're trying to be nice, but sincerely, thank you for this very illuminating talk. This is not the first time I hear you talk about these topics and this particular book. And I always learn a lot from what you share, and we really appreciate your patience as well as generosity and being awesome, not just in delivering this talk and addressing the questions, but also in co-directing this Political Economy Summer Institute. Thanks to all of you for being here. Just so people can know, our student cohort is almost 18 or 19 people, and they are in the background because they don't have their video on. Thank you all for being here, and we will resume next year with PESI 8, perhaps in person. In the meantime, we will be in touch with our fellows on email, and for everybody else, thanks for joining and have a wonderful day. Thanks, Muriam, again. Salam.
Thanks all. Take care. Salamat.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for the organizing and all the work you've put into this, and thanks.
Oh, that's sweet. Salam. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bassam.
Oh, everybody's so nice. Thanks to all the people